Where's clarification?
I do not know.
Attending St. Mattress Cathedral.
She's been really busy lately, so I can't keep track.
Okay, all right, well, we're going to discuss that little video clip, but first of all...
Do you need this at all, by the way?
What is that?
The laptop?
You need it. Yeah, I will. You're going to have to play us some music after a while. Okay, Egyptian music, actually, if we get to it. Well, just exactly what do we do in here? I don't know. A lot of people don't know. Apparently, the administration doesn't really understand what goes on in here. But the bottom line is we're asking questions that relate to what is the nature of being human. And I think that has a direct bearing on your responsibility as a musical artist. And I know that's a term that's not familiar around here or used very often. I don't think that you are essentially performers, but seen in the light of what the word performance means, you might be. What does the word performance mean, or to perform? Have any idea? Make up something.
Bring to life something through our being.
Okay, well, that's within hailing distance. It's made up of two units, the prefix per and what? Form, right? Or form up, which means what?
Form.
Form, right. What does per mean? Potassium permangate.
Really?
No. What does that mean? I'm not sure that per means exactly that in terms of that chemical formula.
Like,
No. Does it mean like for? Or like, no?
Through. It means through. So a performer is a person that puts form through, right? So you are actually, in that sense, you are an interpreter. What does interpret mean?
Between, yeah.
Pretz.
Well, that's a more complicated word. Inter, pre, stands. Which means what? Inter means what? Between. Pretense means what?
Pretense?
Tenere is probably in there somehow. And pre means what? Inter pretens. To stand before, in between, is really what it means. So you're like a middleman that stands between the work of art and the person that's going to receive that experience, right? So you stand in front of the work, and at the same time, you stand in between the work and the experience of that work. Well, that is a part of artistry, but a more profound part of artistry is that since art has actually been around for quite a long while, it must mean something. It must be an attempt to express an aspect of what it means to be a human. And I think that if you're a musician, you must always keep that at the top of the list, what it means to be a human, because you are expressing what people, artists, have felt, what it means to be human. Well, today we're going to take a journey through evolutionary history. And I am no anthropologist. I am no paleontologist. I'm not a biologist. I'm not a mathematician. I'm not a logician. I'm nothing, right? That's why I'm living in obscurity. No, I am a musician. I think that I'm a musician. But I do believe that it's extremely important if you are an artist to know exactly something about where you stand in relationship to the natural world. Do you not agree? And as a matter of fact, I think that that's probably one of the most important things you should do. Now, how many of you have seen this before?
On your Facebook, I think.
Well, I did post it as an advertisement for today's class, and I'm very happy to see that there are at least 50 people in here. All right. Well, what is this? That's a cave painting, yes. Do you have any idea of the time frame of the cave paintings? I think I gave you, you should have one of these handouts. It's actually a reproduction of that. You have any idea when the cave paintings began to appear, or these specifically? This?
40,000.
Yes. All right. The cave painting or cave art begins to appear roughly about 40,000 years ago. All right. Chauvet is the first big cave painting. I think it's the oldest one. Werner Herzog did a documentary on the cave paintings from Chauvet. But this is a little later than that, by like 25,000 years or so. And I think we can date the paintings, the cave paintings at Le Cas, which this is from, to about roughly 20,000 to 15,000 years ago. Now that's an unimaginable long time. Can you imagine 20,000 years ago? No, I don't think anyone can. I can't even imagine. Well, I can, because I have a kind of personal history, but I can imagine like 90 years ago. No, I'm not 90 years old, but all right, well, I'm now going to sit. So our experience of time is rather local, I think, but the facts remain that the Earth has an incredibly long history. Now, this work and the cave paintings are a product of a great upheaval in evolutionary history. And what is evolution? What does that mean, really? The evolution of musical technique.
Is it
The evolution of language.
juxtaposition of evoke and convolution?
I don't know. Is there such a thing as the evolution of language? Well, if you know what the evolution of language is, well, I'm going to put you at the top of the list for the Nobel Peace Prize. Okay? I don't think we can discuss the evolution of language in any important way. I think there has been progress. There's been some progress in understanding evolutionary aspects that lead to the distinctive cognitive ability of language. I think we can do that. So, is the term the evolution of musical technique, is that a correct term? I think not. I think not. Well, it's clearly apparent that the great apes, as marvelous as they are, represent some kind of point in evolutionary history from which we probably, and most likely, definitely, originated. Now, my concept of evolution is a little, well, let me say this. There are two approaches to evolution. One you heard in this little snippet that relates to music, why music. And that idea about evolution says that things change, or things are the way they are, because they're predicated on this series of very slow, grinding changes, gradualism. Things change gradually. And that gradual change is a product of certain principles of what? As a relationship to the environment, yes? And so an organism does what according to pressure from the environment? It adapts, right? So the gradual progression in evolution is a product of the combination of adaptive things that happen, and you've heard the expression that evolution is a tinkerer. It creates adaptations by hinging them onto pre-existing things in an organism. And so it's not the most efficient or the most radical thing. And so an organism progresses or evolves by this gradual buildup of change, very, very slow. Well, that's an adaptionist point of view, and natural selection is definitely a force in evolution, but adaptation and natural selection aren't the only things that drive evolution. As a matter of fact, probably more specifically, what drives evolution are random mutations that occur in an organism. And it's been well known and well documented that slight changes in the replication of DNA, a DNA sequence, can yield rather dramatic changes in a phenotype. What is a phenotype?
The way a genotype is expressed visually.
Yes.
Physically. Like the way
Well,
it
it's
looks.
an aspect of the genotype, right? If you follow Dawkins' ideas, the genotype is expressed through the vehicle of the phenotype. So the phenotype is actually a vehicle for the preservation and the transmission of the genes to continue, right? Well, I think that is, nobody can actually deny that. However, a major factor in evolutionary history is the idea of saltation, or what gives rise to not adaptation, but exaptation. Things that suddenly arise as a result of a random mutation in the genome or in the DNA sequencing. Now, there are three ways in which such a random change can affect the organism. The first way is it doesn't affect it. The random mutations or copying errors can just simply maybe be in there and are not expressed. They don't have any effect on the organism. Well, that idea is actually being challenged, because what we thought at one time were junk sequences in codons, right, may turn out to be important in the expression of some genetic material that perhaps would not otherwise be expressed. All right, so a random mutation might not affect the organism in any specific way. But then there could be a random mutation in the sequencing that could give rise to a catastrophic sequence of events that would destroy the organism. So what would that be? Have you seen the new Blade Runner film? It's interesting to talk about that, because it presupposes certain ideas about the human organism that are patently incorrect, but it's a great idea. If you saw the first Blade Runner, the Tyrell Corporation invents these replicants, right? And so the replicants that come to Earth, and they're seeking their creator or their maker so that they can live longer, they go visit Dr. Tyrell, and they want to know the secret to make them live longer. And he says that's not possible. we tried everything. But in the sequencing, it always gave rise to aberrant conditions that produced viruses, and the specimen was dead before it ever left the table. So that's another way in which a error in copying or a mutation can affect the organism, can obliterate it or prevent replication. The third kind is that a slight change in the sequence can give rise to a tiny twist in the organization of the organism that can produce terrific or large changes in the phenotype or in the organism itself. Well, I think that many people would agree that the basic driving force in evolution, if you look at it from a large scale, you have to say that natural selection and adaptation are vital forces. But actually, the engine that is really at the core is this copying and the slight mutations that occur that do produce changes in an organism. And those are called exaptions. And it's probably the main engine that drives evolution. Some people disagree with that. These people essentially disagree with that idea. And so there are two approaches. One evolutionary approach is that there is an adaptionist theory and natural selection that says that the environment influences or causes the organism to change, but it changes gradually over long periods of time. The other idea is that evolution, yes, does proceed like that. However, the main force is the discontinuity that you see, particularly in the human lineage. There are great discontinuities, and that doesn't imply that there are necessarily gaps in the sequencing, but there are definite discontinuities in the human lineage, and those are apparently signals of slight changes or mutations in the DNA sequencing, and they give rise to different genus or different species, and that particular idea culminates in Homo sapiens. Now, is it clear the difference between those two ideas about evolution? All right. And one of the major proponents of the saltation or the discontinuity in evolution is Stephen Jay Gould and others, and the proponents for the other side of evolutionary history would be Dawkins, Richard Dawkins. Now, I'm no expert on evolutionary history. I'm not an evolutionary biologist. I'm not anything like that. But I do read. And Stephen Jay Gould was a prolific writer. And I've read many of his works. And I've read a lot of ideas from paleontologists that have spent their life studying the fossil record of the human lineage. And I've also read a great deal of Richard Dawkins. And my opinions are informed by all of those ideas. And I'm not trying to push any one single idea on you, except the ideas, of course, that I have, which are unequivocally correct, yes. But at any rate, no, you know I don't mean that. Well, let's look at this little handout that I've given you. And
Do you have extra copies for?
well, the penalty for being late is that you have a copy.
Thank you.
Why am I doing this in the first place? Well, because I'm starting to talk about the history of music. Now, I know there is no history of music course that starts this way, but in my opinion, it probably should, right? Because music just didn't, come out of a box of chocolates. You pick one up and say, oh, that's music. Well, it does have a place in the evolutionary history of humanity. How old is the Earth?
4
You're
billion
giving
years
us
something.
years.
4 million years?
Billion.
Built 4.5, something like that, right? I would think so, yes. Well, I do not believe that that information is a belief. I think it is rooted in scientific inquiry. And science does not have answers. Science has theories, right? And those theories are either refuted or confirmed by what? We've been through this many times before. An empirical process, right? Not an empiricist process, but an empirical process through the construction of experiments, if possible, and then the evaluation of those experiments, which either refute or confirm some abstract idea that contributes to the advancement of a particular theory or of scientific knowledge. Science does not provide ultimate decisions or information about phenomena. It's completely open-ended, and it is a terrific mistake to think that science provides unequivocal answers about things. That is not part of the scientific method. However, it does produce evaluations that have, in the correct sense, can withstand constant testing. And the constant testing is usually referred to in scientific theory as what?
Experimenting.
The scientific method.
Falsification, right? All right. So things that hold true in one domain, if you discover something else, it could not falsify something in a lower domain, but show that there is something even deeper or higher that is functioning. Now, let's look at the chart on the ruler on the left-hand side of the page has an undefined beginning, right? It looks like it continues. The numbers start at 4 and then go 3, 2, 1 to 0, which presumably is the current age. All right, and this is measured in millions of years. Yes? Okay. Now, what era are we in from a geological standpoint? Do you know your eras and epochs and periods?
I remember.
Begins with a C. Cenozoic, right? Cenozoic, right? And the Cenozoic period extends, or era, you see, I use language indiscriminately, and I should not do that. Era, that comes from what? Goes from what period to what period, or what time frame?
66 million years ago.
65 million years ago, right? To the present. Right, why 65 million years? What happened 65 million years ago?
Was it the asteroid?
It was a mass extinction event, right? Which is pretty much confirmed. I don't think this is any kind of belief. I think it's something that's pretty much been confirmed. That was the event that ended the reign of the dinosaurs, right? And the dinosaurs had essentially been around on Earth for extending back at least how many millions of years? In excess, perhaps, of 120 million years. Wow. Now, there have been major extinction events in the history of the Earth all along. There have been at least 4 or 5 noticeable mass extinction events. What was the last mass extinction event that gave rise to at least the current period of things that you see in the world, organisms that you see in the world? Begins with the C also. Do you all not know anything about this?
Nope.
You don't? Oh my gosh.
I know about the Cambrian extinction. That's
Yes,
really not what
the Cambrian explosion,
explosion.
right? Which gave rise to a proliferation of new types of body forms, including body forms that had more substantial shells or exteriors, right? And how many body plans did essentially evolve during the Cambrian explosion? This is really kind of interesting to think about. There are only basically about 35 body plans that emerge out of the Cambrian. And we are examples of that, right? So are spiders. So are other creatures. What do I mean by body plan? What is the characteristic of the human body plan?
Like a spine with 4
There is a central axis, yes, and there are things. What? Go ahead. What?
It's like a symmetric.
Yes, it's essentially symmetrical, right? However, one of the distinguishing features about the human brain is its asymmetry. But the asymmetry does not refer to the substantial difference between the size of the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. It refers essentially to distributional properties of various types of activity the brain conducts. They're not equal. Right? Every activity is not mirrored on one side of the brain and on the other. There's some asymmetries to properties of neurological structure. Right? So that's what that means. Okay. Well, apparently the history of the extends roughly from about 4 or 5 million years ago. What does that word mean? Hominidae. What? Well, obviously a hominid is something that is human-like, right? But essentially that term means the ape-like individual that begins an evolutionary path that leads to modern human beings, right? Now, the early hominids were really essentially no more than apes. And on this little diagram, which is from Ian Tattersall's incredible book, Becoming Human, and Tattersall, I don't know whether he's active there anymore, was at the Museum of Natural History in New York. And he's an incredibly brilliant man, a wonderful person, and many of his talks are on YouTube. And if you have a chance to listen to some of them, you should. He's a paleontologist, and obviously he works with the fossil record. So this is taken from his book, Becoming Human. And in the 90s, although we really didn't hear about this until kind of long after that, 5 or 6 years after that. There was discovered a part of a skeleton that was identified as a kind of ape, but it had unusual features that implied that in some sense it was bipedal. Now, that word refers to an ape-like creature that presumably had new features of bipedalism. What does that mean?
Walking upright.
Yes, walking in some manner upright. Okay? Now, this Ardipithecus ramidus is a very, very ancient fossil. And there have been more examples discovered. And this was dated to be approximately 4-point-something million years old. There are other fossils, I believe, that have pushed that back to 5 million years. And some people believe that it could actually go back as far as 7 million years. That's a stretch, but that's like a very liberal estimate. But at least we have this fossil, or parts of it. Ardipithecus, what does that word mean?
Australopithecus.
No, Ardipithecus. As a matter of fact, we should look at some of these terms. Pithecus means what? You know, this is why you should have your digital devices fired up and look at all of this. For 2 reasons. First of all, I might be lying to you. You know, I might say, oh, Johann Sebastian Bach was born in 1850.
I think it is Australopithecus.
No, Ardipithecus. A-R-D-I. What is the root? Ardip. What does Pithecus mean? P-I-T-H-E-C-U-S. Look, a little kind of deductive reasoning can tell you what it means. What do you think? Just take a wild guess. Leave off the Arctic part. Doesn't all this, these things, although it's not clearly established here, Ardipithecus, and then Australopithecus, and then
The Pithecus.
or something like
Paranthropus, but
ape-like.
yes, the word Pithecus means ape. What does the prefix Ardi mean?
Ground or floor?
What?
Ground or floor?
Yes, it's an Arab root, right? So we're considering Ardipithecus ramidus is at the ground level, right? These words are interesting. Okay, well, that's barely considered to be bipedal. Now, wait a minute. What is the significance of bipedalism? Why? Why do you think that was an adaptive property in the apes, the great apes, and signals a difference, you know, something different happening? Ramidus was still capable of swinging from branches, so it used that also as a means of locomotion or getting around. But it was capable, we know from certain anatomical or structural variations in the skeleton, that it was able, possibly, of bipedalism. Why do you think that evolved? Now, if you can answer that question, you can take over Mr. Tattersall's position at the Museum of Natural History.
To hunt better.
My
But why would, well, okay, Why would it be necessary to have improved hunting abilities?
When you get hungry.
Yeah, you have to survive.
Maybe
Now, wait a
something
minute.
in the environment changed.
Yes, there's an environmental change. However, this is one of the things that I believe that we must be able to think about in terms of evolution. You have an organism and you have the environment. Well, the environment certainly influences the organism, but you have to also understand that the organism in some way manipulates the environment. So it's a two-way street. And if you take that approach to evolution, that incorporates both the concepts of natural selection and adaptation, as well as exaption. And these things that occur in species that are mapped onto pre-existing forms and that use a particular component of a pre-existing form that was used for something else, and then it turns it into another feature. Insect wings. The wings of insects were presumably originally used for what? This is a perfect example of this. Yes, heat exchange, right? And later on, they were exacted to become modes of locomotion, yes? Now, anybody that's ever looked at an insect knows that that is not the exclusive mode of locomotion of insects, right? They also do what? Crawl. Okay? All right. Where was I? Okay, so bipedalism apparently arose as an adaptation to some kind of pressure from the environment. Well, what kind of pressure was that? What's the greatest kind of environmental pressure there is?
Death.
That's a result of an environmental pressure, right? Suppose you had this cataclysmic rift in a continent and you were living there and, you'd be swallowed up like Prometheus. What influences, what in the environment can create catastrophic influences? Well,
Change in temperature.
temperature fluctuations, climate change, right? Now, climate change is not a political concept. It is a scientific one. And anyone that knows anything about the geological history of the planet understands the massive force and shaping force of climate change, right? Now, during the rise of the hominids, the Earth was going through a rather chaotic and violent series of climate changes that essentially led to what is known as the Pleistocene. What is the Pleistocene? I'm telling you, you will never hear any of this from anybody around here, right? So I'm trying, What is the Pleistocene? The Pleistocene is an epoch, or period.
The first epoch of the Quaternary period.
Very good. Okay. The Quaternary period must be part of what? What era?
Cenozoic.
Cenozoic, yes, which is the era that we're in right now. So the Pleistocene is part of the Quaternary. Is it epoch? They call it an epoch?
The Quaternary period.
Period.
It's an epic in the period.
Right. Okay. All right. So what is characteristic of the Pleistocene? What does it say?
was cold.
Yes, it was cold. The Pleistocene precipitates into the Great Ice Age. And don't ask me why I know all these things. I do, but in order to talk to you about it, I have to sit there and think about it and then make notes and then try to remember it. And I do, I do. What are the dates for the Pleistocene? Now look, we've started out at roughly 4 million years, right? And then we're moving through a period of climate change that precedes chaotic movements in climate fluctuations. Oh, by the way, where are we talking about essentially? Gondwana or Africa, right? We're talking about Africa. What happens in Africa that is a result of the climate change, the chaotic climate changes? Yes, that's correct. The climate begins to dry out, and as a result of that, rain becomes periodic or seasonal. No longer is it like rainforest or heavy, dense forest with, precipitation that is, essentially continuous or regular. The climate changes so that there are periods of drying out, vast periods of drying out, and the rain becomes much more seasonal. So what do you think would happen to the forest or the vegetation?
More scarce.
What happens to plants that you don't water in the
Die.
house? They turn to what? If you live long enough.
Dust.
Dust! They turn to dust. In other words, they disintegrate. Now, if the land is drying out, it gives rise to less vegetation, less forestation. So the deep forests turn into just woodlands, grassy woodlands. And so the forest recedes further into the inland. And this opens up more wooded, just sparsely wooded spaces. And eventually that precipitates out into the, what is the correct term for that? Begins with an S. The open savannas, which really don't occur till about 1 million years ago, roughly speaking, during the Pleistocene. What is the Serengeti? I just said it. The kind of open, grassy savannas, right? So typical of that environment. And it took a while for the climate change to produce this area. But apparently bipedalism emerges out of receding forests, and for some reason is an adaptation to the changing environment and allowed them more locomotion to move around. Well, I think that is like an elementary school explanation, but since this is not a paleontological or geology class, we'll move on. Now, eventually, this radical kind of climate fluctuation precipitated into the Great Ice Age, the last ice age, in which massive areas of the Earth were covered by glaciers or ice sheets. The gradual cooling off, warming up, cooling off went on from about when? When is the Pleistocene period? Or
2.5 million years ago to 12 million years ago, give or take.
Well, I learned it to be roughly 2.6 million years ago till about 10,000 years ago. Is that about right? Yeah, okay. Now, it is actually during that time that huge changes to the hominids began to take place. And so let's look at the little branching tree here. It becomes immediately apparent that this is not a kind of gradual change, right? That there are definite discontinuities. And so the Australopithecus afarensis, no longer Ardipithecus, right? That branches off into what is now called the Australopithecus. What does Australa mean? Pithecus means ape, so what does Australa mean? I don't know. Would you please tell me? I do know, but I want you to tell me.
I already tried looking it up.
Australa? Well, look under Australopithecus.
Australa. Chinchilla.
No.
Southern?
Yes.
Australia.
So it's the southern apes. I guess that would be an appropriate term for me, since I'm from Atlanta, Georgia.
Australa. Oh.
It means southern ape. That's what it means. All right, so we're talking about South Africa, or southern Africa, right? Okay, well, you can see that the Australopithecus branches off. On one side, we have the Australopithecus africanus, and on the other side, you have what is now called the Paranthropus. What does that mean? That's Greek. Anthropos, you know what that means.
Human.
Yes. That means, and para means beside, or next to. That's interesting, because the Australopithecus africanus then splits off into what is properly called, and these are all approximate terms, Homo habilis, an individual that anatomically begins to approach the characteristics of modern human beings. So why Paranthropus? The Paranthropus were a robust form of the Australopithecus. And it used to be that they were called Australopithecus robustus or whatever. But the terminology has been changed recently, so Paranthropus is the side line, the discontinuous line that, goes nowhere. But if you just look at this, the timeline, you see that it isn't gradual. And you'll also see that at any one given time, there were a variety of hominid species walking around. Yes? So, perhaps competition, perhaps selection, brought an end to various lines and create the discontinuity. We're now on the Australopithecus africanus line, which then splits off to an extinct Rudolfensis. That is a dead end. However, Homo habilis, and we're talking now, we're up to like in the vicinity of 3.2 million, maybe 2 million years ago, something like that, transition in that. I think the representation of where Homo habilis is correct. Yep. And then there's a question mark. We do believe that perhaps Ergaster is a descendant or in the same line as Homo habilis. Now, the migration out of Africa is usually put at 1 million years ago. But I believe, and I think I'm correct about this, examples of Homo ergaster are found in Asia. So that may or may not push that back a little bit. Nonetheless, the anatomical differences in habilis and ergaster are quite dramatically different from the Ardipithecus and Africanus lineage. We have increased upright posture development in the spinal and rib cage, also in the connection between the body and the brain, and there are differences that begin to happen in terms of the skull shape. Still, the size of the skull and the brain is kind of small, not yet as big. The next step from ergaster or Homo habilis is a branching, another discontinuity, Homo erectus. And the cranium of Homo erectus was much more human-like. It resembles the much more human-like. And then there is a split off from ergaster, according to this, which eventually leads to another discontinuity. The common ancestor to us is presumably Homo heidelbergensis. And there are two branches to that, the Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. That brings us essentially clearly within the Pleistocene. Now, somewhere between 1 million years ago and about 40,000 years ago, there were substantial developments, maybe adaptive, some maybe not, that gave rise to pretty much anatomically modern human beings. The Neanderthals were a remarkable species, but it's fairly clear, and I don't think this is controversial anymore, but it might be, that the Neanderthals had very much a kind of highly developed, intuitive, intellectual capacity. And they were able to use it to dominate their region. However, the kind of intuitive intelligence that the Neanderthals had was not the same kind of intelligence that eventually exacted in Homo sapiens and produces the final split between in the Heidelbergensis lineage. So what is that difference? Well, you can see from the chart that this is not a gradual progression, but actually a series of discontinuities that build on what has gone before. And the final step that produced modern human beings had to do not so much with anatomical refinements, but there are some aspects of that I'll discuss in a minute. But basically, in terms of brain organization, or the structure of the brain. Now, the auditory system of the great apes, and we have to use those to compare ourselves because they're our closest relatives. They're the closest thing, and that's very distant, but they're close to us. The auditory system in a great ape, or chimpanzee, or gorilla, is essentially identical to human beings. But the processing of auditory information is totally different. The distinguishing and unique feature about human mental capacity is that it is no longer intuitive. It is now abstract. And it is only within the period from about 40 million years ago that we notice this change in mental structure. And it is probably a result of some minor, small change in an existing structure. And it is, from what I've read, probably an exception, and probably builds on something of a palette or a series of things that were already evolutionarily developed in the organism. And this one final detail gave rise to the use of these abilities in a radically different way. Now, Gould's term for such things would be spandrels. And spandrels are another word for exaptions. They use existing structures in different ways. They're modified and used in a different way. So apparently when this new way of mental activity took place, the ability to think abstractly or symbolically, to process, as Galstel says, the distal variables from the environment. The sensory input is processed abstractly or symbolically, and these symbols are combined, and they're combined with other symbols that are used to refer to external elements or elements in the world. But the thing is that these symbols can also be used in a completely abstract or internal way that do not have a reference or used to refer to things outside the world. That is the distinguishing difference between the kind of intuitive intelligence that you find in the rest of the animal world and the kind of abstract or symbolic intelligence that presumably only human beings possess. Now, it's fairly obvious in the archaeological record or in the things that exist out there that there's no evidence of symbolic thinking before about 40,000 years ago. What is the nature of symbolic thinking? Well, I've said. What can it do? It represents the world abstractly, yes? And so, as I've said many times before, that there are two different things that abstraction can do. It can and does process the sensory input from the environment, and it creates arbitrary symbolic images that relate to or used to refer to things in the world. And so that has a practical or a mechanical sense. But the other side of that is, since that it is internal and intentional, it can be used to create psychological entities or things that have no direct reference outside the world. But the thing is that in these kind of abstract mental entities, the same kind of reality or actuality is ascribed to them. And this is the big problem in the great advantage of thinking abstractly. And it's a problem that philosophers and scientists and others have dealt with for many, many years. It is also the source of human creativity. And it is what gives rise to the distinctive property of human cognition, and that is that we create our world. We have an internal conception of the world. Now, that has terrific significance. I mean, we wouldn't be here, and we wouldn't have the environment that we have created to participate in the world. This is an example of abstract thought. Now, why would I say that this cave painting is an example of abstract thought? Is it an authentic representation of the actual world? Well, we don't know because we weren't present 20,000 years ago. But there are things in the world today that look like that, yes? These are representations.
I gotta go to the bathroom.
What do you think the purpose of these cave paintings were? They were discovered actually by, or at least Lakar was discovered by accident, like most of these caves were.
Just to preserve their culture and to communicate.
I don't know.
Because like caves, a lot of the paintings they kind of tell stories, no?
Well, you can assume that they tell a story, but they do have some kind of symbolic meaning, yes? But apparently these caves were not visited frequently, that they were considered sacred spaces. They were considered special spaces or private spaces. And who knows what kind of activity went on in those caves. Some of the caves are incredibly difficult to access, but they are absolutely remarkable. When Picasso visited these caves in the 40s, I believe, he came out and said, well, it's obvious we hadn't learned anything. Well, which is basically true. Now, the implication of human cognitive ability and the idea that it is an exception rather than an adaptation would say that there is a kind of arbitrary or randomness to this particular ability, that it was not predicated on some pressure from the environment, and that the small change that occurred in the mental structure of a human being gave rise to thought as we know it, in an entirely different way of representing the world. Now, isn't it obvious that apes have means of communication? Yes? But if this is an exception and arose through a random mutation in mental structure, do you think it's related to communication? That it was an adaptive property that enhanced communication? No, you can't look at it that way. It's a kind of mental ability. It's something that was produced as a result of a random mutation that provided it immediately a different way of processing sensory information. And it is what separates humans from the rest of the hominids or the primates. Now, there are a couple of things that happened along the way that you can see how this kind of internal way of dealing or abstract way of dealing with the world, it arose in an individual and maybe it arose several times. It's possible. But whatever it was passed on through one individual to another individual. And eventually it was passed on within a group and then was passed on or perpetuated and became a, standard feature of Homo sapiens. Well, how did communication, the use of language as a communicative device, how did that happen? Well, during the process of the development of the human anatomy or the skeletal system, several things changed. The skull of the human being became much more, instead of flattened like the Neanderthals, became much more extended or flexed. And in the process of that flexation, there were changes in the connection of the spinal cord or the brain stem. And the brain stem and the spinal cord became much more reinforced, and the vocal tract became much more highly evolved. The larynx moved down. The pharynx, which is the tube that opens up into the nasal cavity and the oral cavity, was much longer, had a kind of loop effect. And there are many people who believe that that anatomical change was due to the necessity for increased respiration. So the connections with the spinal cord and the rib cage, it gave a greater muscular control in the expansion of the lungs in and out. So it increased air capacity. Well, obviously, when the larynx descended and the pharynx extended, it gave rise to the ability for a human vocal system to produce infinitely more sounds. Sounds that the apes could not possibly make. In addition to that, the hyoid bone, that little flexible bone, also moves. And so, apparently, when this change in mental activity occurred, it was there for a rather long period of time until the until the vocal tract system and the changes that had occurred anatomically, presumably for respiration, were conscripted for speech. Now, you have to assume that in the meantime, the speech must have been much more articulate or much more sophisticated. You know anything about chimpanzee speech?
I can.
How many sounds can a chimpanzee make? That's a trick question because no one knows. But there have been identified about 30 different, distinctively different sounds. But they are combined in ways that we have no clue to. But about 30 different sounds. How many sounds can a human being make? Infinite sounds. However, the phonotactic systems that eventually feed into the articulation of thought, which is speech, are highly constrained computational systems. There are only about 5 or 6 different ways in which those sounds are used to produce the infinite variety of languages. And language itself is a combinatorial system of digital infinity. It's based on hierarchical structuring and recursive hierarchical structuring. And that is something that is totally different from the kind of intuitive intelligence, high intelligence, but intuitive intelligence of the great apes. Now, there's a new movie about one of the first persons to research apes in the wild and talk about their behavior. Who was that? Do you know who that was? Jane Goodall. And there's a new movie. Please, if you have a chance to see it, although it's not going to come to Universal Artists theaters near you. It's probably in some kind of art theater. But she was the first person to look at the great apes, not only gorillas, but chimpanzees. And there are 2 things that she noticed. That when they use sounds to communicate, but the communication was through emotion. That the sounds that a chimpanzee makes is predicated on some kind of emotional response. And that a chimpanzee was highly unlikely to make any sound unless it was connected with the expression of some emotional state. Now, I think that that is true, but it is not true of human language and the use of sound systems in human language. Human language is not based on emotion. It is used for thought, the expression of thought. It was confiscated and matched to the auditory system for communicative purposes. And that probably can be viewed as an adaptation. Right? So now that brings us, are you following what I'm trying to say? That what I said in the last couple of minutes is basically I probably should have said an hour ago. But, you know, we have to have some like dramatic build-up. Right? But is it clear what I'm trying to say? That it's not at all obvious that this mental capacity that emerged suddenly had anything to do with communication, that it was a mental ability, and that eventually it was used for communicative purposes, right? And it, of course, was able to be used for the expression of thought, both internal and external. And so then it began to have an overwhelming adaptive function and purpose, or ability, don't say purpose, right? So this is where music comes into the scene. Now, the little video clip that we saw does not take this point of view at all, right? And you picked that up immediately, I think. Yes? Why? Now, describe to me what you remember the video clip that we saw at the beginning? You don't? I would have to turn off the live stream feed in order to look at it again. All right, because we operate in complete anonymity here. So what were your observations about that? You recall? You said it started off on the...
He started off on the right track when he had some initial comments about the computational, what the brain must be doing when it hears music on a computational level, but then he immediately abandoned that track and started talking about psi figures and bird calls and what was the other one? The experience of it all.
Right. Well, first of all, he talks about functionalism. Well, if you subscribe to the idea, which I think is really correct, and I think it's indisputable, that one of the main engines in evolution is saltation, or these sudden changes that are brought about by minor copying errors in the DNA, right? If you look at it that way, then it implies that functionalism or adaptions that occur that shape the organism over long periods of times cannot possibly be true. No one is denying the fact that there is such a thing as natural selection or adaptation, but that is not a principal engine that drives what we see in the evolutionary record in terms of the hominids. This diagram, which I mean is not like, written in stone, pardon the pun, right, implies discontinuities. And so there was no functional property, obviously, for this mental ability. But one of the reasons why I am so interested in the connection between language and music is that they obviously, at least to me, obviously share the distinguishing mental feature of the cognitive feature of human beings. And that is this kind of abstract, symbolic, hierarchically structured way of dealing with information. Or we call it thought, which is then expressed through some sensory motor articulation, either by gesture or by vocalization. The vocalization aspect of it apparently was later than the actual appearance of this ability. it was apparently there from maybe the beginning of modern Homo sapiens, 100,000 years ago, maybe more than that, maybe less than that. But there's unequivocal evidence of the use of this symbolic ability about 40,000 years ago. And guess what appears in the archaeological record? Not only evidence of beads or bone tools, very sophisticated with inscriptions on them, but what else? Musical instruments from about 35,000 years ago. Flutes that are made out of bird bone or ivory. Now, it's highly debated whether some of these instruments were like holes that were put there by some carnivore. But a little later than 35,000 years, 20,000 years, 15,000 years, there is no doubt that these represent musical instruments. Now, in this little video, he says, well, music has no functional property to it. Yes?
So why didn't this happen when their skull changed and they suddenly had the capacity, or it didn't happen until like the vocal tract evolved?
No, the vocal tract was evolving from about Homo habilis and ergaster on.
Right, but 40,000 years ago, they were finally able to make more complex sounds or something with their voice. So,
but it never occurred to them.
It never occurred to them without the voice that they could do these things. Okay. Gotcha.
Right? The mental capacity, preceded.
Right.
The,
but they didn't know how to implement it.
Right, right. And that is a long path. And it's a path of discovery to associate this symbolic thinking with this new way of using the vocal tract. And that's a very good point, because in primates, the vocalizations stem from emotional properties. And the emotions are what? Connected directly to states of survival, or mechanisms for survival, yes? Human language or human mental ability is no longer directly connected to that. It's a point that I've been trying to get across for many years, right? And it serves no real survival purpose. It becomes, and very definitely, an advantage in survival once it became matched to the vocal system, right? But essentially, it has no functional purpose per se. But it does change the way in which Homo sapiens relate to the world, right? The way they process information from the environment. Are you getting what I'm saying? I may not be saying it, in the most elegant way. So, therefore, naturally, both thought and or language, which is the expression of thought, and music serve no purpose. There is no functional purpose to that. Language becomes functionally adaptive or has a function. It's communication. But language itself and the ability to think in this abstract way has no functional property. So why would you expect music to have some kind of functional property? This is why everyone scratches their head about, what is the purpose or function of music? Well, it must be connected to bird cries or to, animal sounds. According to my reasoning, that doesn't make any sense. It's not an extension of chimpanzee vocalization. It isn't. It's something completely abstract. And it's a representation of the unique way in which human beings process information. Do you see that? Now, you should be challenging me on something about the sound and emotion. No one has hit me with that yet?
There is emotion in music.
Of course there is emotion in music. But what is the connection?
Well, there's emotion in language too. And there's communication in language, but that's not its primary structure or its
Right.
even primary purpose.
Right. So the emotional side of it, or the communication side of it, is something that became a part of it. Yes? But now, that's also not exactly correct. Because if you are following my theory that when human beings developed this distinctive kind of cognitive ability, it was abstract, right? So the way it processed all sensory information had to be subject to this regulatory or new way of thinking, a new way of processing information. Yes? Not just one or two things, but everything. So emotional responses in human beings, while they are connected to the physicality of the organism or organically connected to the entity, they are also processed and are interpreted in a human being by thought. And so the emotional states of a human being have an abstract property to them. You following what I'm saying? So they have a psychological content to them. In chimpanzees, the emotional responses expressed vocally are survival instincts. They are connected to fundamental drives, and they are instinctual or intuitive. In human beings, they may exhibit those properties, but fundamentally they are abstract. This is why something in both language and music can initiate emotional responses, but it's always a gray area. I mean, when somebody hears a piece of music and this person sitting on aisle 6 says, "Oh my gosh, that is just so pathetic. It's so disappointing. It's so, this." And the next person on row G or something says, "Wow, this is ecstatic. It's just like the most transformative thing I've ever heard." Right? And so it's very dangerous to get into those areas because that is not a guide to the interpretation of either linguistic structure or musical structure. I do believe that that's a component, but it's an indication that your view of the world is internalist, right? And your thoughts are internal. Now, fortunately, since there is hopefully one human brain, that there are enough similarities in the way in which we process information that we can be sympathetic to these ideas. Otherwise, language would never be able to be used as a communicative mechanism. Do you not agree? You don't agree. So we have some shared abilities, right? The cognitive platform is something that we all share. But we all create worlds in our mind, individually in our minds. And hopefully there is some commonality in that. So the shared meaning that arises in this cognitive function that we share is called what? The shared meaning is
Sure.
culture. Yes. Now, cultures can vary in arbitrary ways. But the human cognitive capacity does not vary in arbitrary ways. Are we on the same page? Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. Now, let us go on and look at some of the examples of early abstract or symbolic art. the first figure you have is a little horse, and it's called a Vogelherd horse. And it's actually from the Ordovician period. That is a that is an archaeological, paleontological term. It's not geological, and that is a period from about 32,000 years ago, found in southwest Germany. It's made out of mammoth ivory, and this replication doesn't do it justice, but the horse's face is pretty exquisitely carved. And the legs have kind of disappeared, but it's an amazing example of a symbolic representation. Let's turn the page.
Why does it say all this?
Oh, forget that. It's not a woman. I don't know, that's some, you can never trust the internet. Really. Okay, and the next example, everyone has had a heyday over this one also. It's basically from the same period, maybe 35,000 years ago, and this is called the Lion Man. Some people call it the Lion Woman, right? But who cares, right? The thing is that this is from 35,000 years ago, and that certainly looks like something or somebody that's walking upright, yes. Looks kind of human, but it has the head of a lion. It's anybody's guess what that means. Now, what civilization that occurred much later uses this same kind of iconography? Many civilizations, but what's the most prominent one?
Egypt?
Egyptian, yes. The Egyptian civilization is the precursor to us. The Greeks borrowed many things, actually most things, from the Egyptians. All right, so that's a pretty remarkable statue. And that's also ivory. And there have been various reconstructions. But it's, pretty remarkable. That is also from Austria, I believe, Germany. Then on the next page we have the famous Venus of Willendorf. Well, nobody knew who Venus was back then. This is from approximately 25,000 to 13,000 years ago. This is a little more advanced. This is considered to be some kind of fertility object, product of the fertility cult. The fact that women were viewed as like the main deal or the source of all creation. And Camille Paglia talks about the Mother Earth cult and the importance of the feminine and the female in early philosophy and early religion. I particularly like the head of that statue. Some people say it's a cap, some people say it's braided hair, I don't know. But the exaggerated features probably point to some aspect of fertility or creation. Now, finally, we have something that relates to music. All right? Well, look up there. There's a case of instruments. Those instruments are located in the Cairo Museum, right? And these are presumably some of the earliest flutes from the Egyptian or Pharaohic dynasties. Now, the Egyptian instruments, and we're talking about 3,500 years, not 35,000, but 3,500 years, and the beginnings of the basically the Egyptian civilization, and continuing on until about 1,600 years BC, music was extremely important in the Egyptian society, but apparently none of it was written down. And so it was probably, like most music, improvised. But the instruments tell us something about the properties of the musical system that the Egyptians had. And I've mentioned before, and we'll talk about it in a different class, that contemporaneous with the Egyptian music is the Sumerian music and the tablets from Ugarit that have reference to musical notation and tunings of the Sumerian lyre or harp. And that's the first example of written notation or instructions for a musical system. Now, if you look at the next page, you will see the results of experiments that were conducted in the 80s and actually continues today in the reconstruction of some of these ancient Egyptian flutes. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that if you have a string instrument, unless you have written specific information, there's no way to determine what the tuning was, right? Because it goes out of tune. The strings could disintegrate, right? However, with wind instruments, it's far more likely that we get a clear picture of what the sounds that came out of the instrument actually were. Now, there are examples of Alos type instruments, although we have no idea what the reed, whether single or double reed, was actually like. So that's something that has to be fantasized or recreated. And then there are these flutes. A lot of them are in obviously very bad condition. But in this experiment, which was conducted in Egypt, they made replicas of 6 of the instruments. And then they tried to restore several of the instruments. And they restored them well enough so that you could play on them. And there are actual recordings of these instruments. And I think you can find them on the internet. You'd have to search a little bit for it. But there are recordings of these instruments. And it turns out that the Egyptian flute, which in its basic form is about like this, it was long. And it was usually made out of bamboo. And there were 2 ways of notching or putting holes in the flute. Some of them were notched at the joints in the bamboo. Others had the holes in between the joints. Now, virtually, look at the notes in these flutes. The first flute, number 69814, right?
That's a lot of flutes.
What?
That's a lot of flutes.
I know. Well, I don't know. I guess it's the what number it is in the museum catalog, right? Okay, so they assume that it's an F, and the second note was a G, and there's no third note. And then there is some kind of B flat, and then there's a C and a D. Well, now it doesn't take much mental power to figure out what kind of scale is that. It's a pentatonic scale, yeah? Okay. Now, look at the second flute. There's 7 notes. All an F or F or A? Well, is there a reason why that is so F or A?
It's length.
What?
It's length.
It's length, yeah, presumably. But what kind of tonality would that first flute produce naturally? Now, you can produce any kind of sounds on the flute. And besides the fact that the Egyptian flute was blown kind of with the flute in a kind of diagonal or more or less vertical position, it's extremely difficult to make a sound out of it. Many people can't play it. But there are experts because the Arab ney, is an N-A-Y, it's a flute, is played actually the same way. So the flute is played kind of diagonally like that.
Are these transverse flutes where the air is being blown across a hole, or are they more recorder-like where the air is blown
No,
through
the
the
air is
instrument?
blown across, but it's not like the modern flute.
Right.
Right. But you would consider it blown like a transverse flute.
Okay.
Okay? All right. So, therefore, by moving it around or rolling it or putting it in a different position, you can do all kinds of things with the inflectional properties, right? Or intonational properties. But basically, the holes are in the flute that generate, in this first flute, something that resembles a pentatonic scale. And it's diatonic, right? I've heard this flute. I mean, you can find it online. It's interesting. All right, the second flute is 7 tones. F, G, a very low A, and I don't know how low that is, right? It's probably a miscalculation in where the hole was placed, but who knows, right? Then the B flat, then the C, D, then E flat, then F. What kind of scale is that? If we eliminate the A flat, or the A double flat, and say that it's just like A flat, it vaguely resembles what?
E flat, Dorian.
Yeah, with the raised 6th degree, it would be Dorian, right? Okay. Now, the Dorian mode is actually a variation of the natural diatonic mode, yes? Is it? All right. Find that scale.
The major scale, or
It would be major, yes?
are you looking for a Dorian or an actual?
Well, Dorian is related to minor, which is related to major by lower third, right? There are only 2 natural scales in the diatonic system. One is major, right, where I look at it as the contiguous thirds on the 1st, 5th, and 4th degree are major minor, and in the minor mode, it's minor major. Yeah? So there are only 2 natural systems. In order to derive all the other sequences, you have to either add a sharp or a flat. This particular scale is related to Dorian, I think. Yep. Still diatonic. Now what about the third flute? Flute number 69816.
What do the asterisks mean? Are those notes?
Approximations.
Okay.
Same thing, isn't it? Okay. What about the last one?
Same thing.
69817.
That's the key.
Same thing, yes? Pitched on a different note, A instead of F. All right. Now, what do you all have the definitive book on music? Of course, my book. I would like for you to look at it's somewhere in the 2nd chapter, the acoustic basis of music. And you'll look at my derivation of the diatonic system.
Is this before or after the Schoenberg Cantus Fermi?
Or after the what?
The Schoenberg
Oh,
abominations.
that's in the logical structure of counterpoint.
Oh, that's the
before
3rd
that.
chapter.
Wait, which
It's
chapter are you?
in the foundational abstractions, first chapter.
First
Oh,
chapter?
first chapter.
First chapter.
Closer to the front or the back?
The second chapter is much longer, so closer to the front.
I mean, of the chapter. Locally.
The page that has axiom at the top. This is for any given diatonic series U. Each pitch Z of the series is represented as a value of harmonic ratio W1, 3 to 2, 5 to 4. You got it?
No.
No, you don't.
Oh,
Found
found.
it. It's the top of the page.
Different axiom.
You know, you have a different way of notating the axiom at the end of the chapter.
I know.
Good.
Okay. All right, well, look at this. All right, you know that I propose that the diatonic system is a kind of recursive, enumerated entity that uses a fundamental tone, and it uses its boundary interval, the fifth, to project the same harmonics. You know, harmonics 3 to 2 becomes a 1, and then you project its third harmonic, and then its fifth harmonic, and then you project a fifth below using the original fundamental as the fifth of a new fundamental below, which is actually the inverse of the upper fifth. 3 to 2 becomes 2 to 3. Now, if you calculate these ratios, and remember all of this is apparently just intonation, right? You come up with these ratios. The fundamental is obviously 1. The second degree is 1.125. The third degree, which is the fifth harmonic, is 1.25. The fourth degree is 1.333. The fifth, obviously, is 1.5, which is the 3 to 2 relationship. The sixth degree, which is from the lower boundary, is 1.666, and the so-called leading tone, or seventh degree, which is from the upper boundary, is 1.875. Now, I would like for you to look at those, which you probably already have done, and compare them with the ratios that are given. And table 2 has the measured frequencies. You can forget about that because that's inconsequential. That's a phonotactic thing. But what's important is the frequency ratios. And let's look at the second flute. Obviously, it starts with the fundamental, which is 1. Then the second degree, given in the flute, is 1.14. How close is that? 1.125 is really 1.13, yes? Is that close?
I guess.
Yes! I think that's pretty darn close. All right? Okay, now let's look at the next degree, 1.22, and the third flute is 1.19, and the third flute is I guess that's 22, yes?
Are these the same 4 flutes?
No.
Oh.
They're different flutes.
Wait,
Okay.
really? Because I see flute number 69814, 69815 on these ratios that correspond to
Oh
these.
yeah.
Turns out the A double flat is
Because how
a
does that make
misprint.
sense
It's
that the
1,
A double
4,
flat
7,
would be
5. They're out of
1
order.
point?
You see it? It's 1. Oh, 4, 6, 7, 5. They're out of order.
Where?
I'm not sure what you're looking
The
at.
The serial numbers.
Oh yeah, it goes 4, 6, 7, 5.
They're a little bit
That's
out of order,
the
but that
6,
doesn't really make any difference.
Wait, 4, 5, 7. Oh,
6.
oh.
We're just comparing the ratios of the flutes. Doesn't matter what notes they're playing, right? Okay. All right, let's go to the third note. The first one that has that note is 1.22, then 1.19, which is 1.2, yeah? and 1.11, which is not. That's pretty low. Okay, let's go to the next tone. 1.36, 1.37, 1.30, 1.38. So 1.333 is the just intonation, right? The next one, obviously if it's a perfect fifth, so-called, it's going to have the ratio 1 to 5. Well, I'll be. One of them has that. The second one almost has it. The third one almost has it. And the last one doesn't quite make it. Right? Okay. All right, and continuing on up. 1.6. We have 1. That's a 6, isn't it? 6.9. I would assume it is. 1.7, 1.64, and really high, 1. That looks weird. 8.8.
Maybe 6.
That, I wouldn't want that in my
6,
orchestra.
6.
Okay. All right. And then the leading tone, that's not the last one, is 1.85. That's pretty darn close. 1.74 and 1.84. Those are all very, very close. And then finally the octave is 2, which you would expect it to be, right? Except in the first two flutes, it's higher than that, stretched. Now, how do you think the Egyptians came up with these ratios?
They probably time traveled and heard our modern conception of tonality pre-Schoenberg and then stole that.
Yes, that's a very logical explanation.
Except for 815, which stole it from Schoenberg.
No. Why do you think they were able to come up with this? They had no machines to deal with this.
They picked sounds that sounded good to them.
Well, that's pretty much the truth. However, where did the knowledge of the overtone series come from? Where was Pythagoras?
Not born.
Greece.
Not born, yes? When did Pythagoras live? Pythagoras of Samos. The 4th century, right? 500.
4th
Yeah.
century mid 300s, right?
What?
4th
That's
century mid
Euclid.
300s.
So 6th century.
Yes.
Yes, 6th century. Euclid is 4th century. Okay, thank you for that correction. Okay, all right. Well, did Pythagoras spend any time in Egypt?
Duh.
Yes.
Yes.
Most likely.
Apparently, like 21 years.
Well,
I don't know what I think that's apocryphal, but at any rate. Well, so where do you think this comes from? It could come from, divisions or knowledge of the harmonic series, right? But more than likely, it comes from what? Now, this is conjectural, but I mean, it's evidenced in the holes that are punched in these instruments.
The ear.
From your ear, right? Natural calculations that if these are so close to just intonation intervals, which are, mathematically pretty much correct, right? Although it's not the tuning system that we use today, although some people maintain that choruses and orchestras play in just intonation, which I think is from the Cinderella period, right? Or some, Snow White, some other fairy tale, right? But
Of course, it's
do you see the close connection between this? And what is the logical conclusion for all of this? Or what is one of the logical conclusions that we might draw from this?
the diatonic scale is fundamental.
And is more than likely some kind of innate property of our biological structure, yes? And it has evolved to reflect the nature of harmonics. And from those, we select out these to produce the diatonic scale. Now, it's odd that the diatonic series is also represented in Sumerian writings and in the notations that tell you how to tune the lyre. They're all diatonic systems. Now, if you were to hear this flute, you would say, oh my gosh, that sounds like, world music. Well, they're not. What is intonation? However, you have to understand that this kind of flute, wind-blown flute like that, can, the pitch can vary and it can be inflected. But the
I think
ratio.
we have to also take into account that these players weren't stupid and were probably adjusting the pitch with half holding or four fingers or breath. They weren't just kind of going.
They weren't just
Fingers
blowing
just
in the
scale.
instrument. That's obvious, right? Okay, well, I hope that you got something out of this excursion into the vast and unfathomable arena of evolutionary history and how it actually relates to the emergence of the totally useless phenomenon of music, but the idea is that it connects to the obviously non-functional property of thought. And it only later assumes adaptive or communicative significance. Thank you so much, and I will see you next time. And we will continue our music history thing.
Oh no.